The rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet ambience of the Roadside Café, a quaint spot tucked off Interstate 70. Inside, a diverse mix of travelers and locals savored their meals, the aroma of fresh coffee and apple pie mingling with the sharp scent of rain-soaked leather jackets. Among them, Sergeant Marcus Reed sat at the counter, nursing his coffee with the deliberate calmness of a retired Marine. His broad shoulders hunched slightly as he flipped through a newspaper, the sunlight glinting off the Marine tattoo etched on his arm. Two bikers, clad in leather jackets patched with skull insignias, burst into the cafe, their laughter harsh and grating. The larger of the two scanned the room with predatory eyes, his gaze landing on Marcus. "Hey, check it out," he said, elbowing his partner and nodding toward the Marine. "Old soldier boy's out for a coffee. Bet he's got some stories." The duo approached, their boots clunking heavily against the wooden floor. The taller one leaned over Marcus, his breath reeking of stale beer and cigarettes. "That a Marine tattoo, old man? What are you, retired?" "Washed up," he sneered, his companion cackling behind him. Marcus barely glanced up from his paper. "Just having my coffee. Mind giving me some space?" His voice was level, steady, but carried a quiet authority that suggested he was more than capable of handling trouble. The smaller biker grabbed Marcus's cup, deliberately spilling its contents across the counter. "Oops. Guess you're out of coffee now." Coffee dripped onto Marcus's newspaper, staining yesterday's headlines. The cafe went silent. The other patrons froze, sensing the growing tension. A trucker at a nearby booth set down his fork. A young waitress clutched her order pad tighter. Marcus calmly wiped the liquid with a napkin, then turned to face the men. "I'll give you one chance to walk away," he said evenly, his weathered hands folding the soaked napkin with precise movements. The taller biker snorted, stepping closer until his shadow loomed over Marcus. "Or what, Marine?" Marcus set the napkin down, his hand tightening into a fist under the counter. The room crackled with anticipation as everyone braced for what might come next, the only sound the soft drip of coffee falling from the counter's edge to the floor. Before we reveal what happens next in this intense standoff, where are you following this story from? Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling tales of courage and justice in unexpected places. The bikers' laughter echoed through the cafe, a grating sound that set every patron on edge. The taller one grabbed Marcus by the collar, rough fingers digging into worn cotton. "You got something to say, tough guy? Or are Marines all bark and no bite these days?" Marcus's expression remained calm, though his muscles tensed beneath his plain shirt. A lifetime of training thrummed through his veins, muscle memory ready to respond. "Last warning," he said quietly, his tone measured but carrying the weight of experience. "Let go and leave peacefully." The smaller biker smirked, reaching into his leather jacket with deliberate slowness. "Or what? You gonna call the cops?" His eyes swept the room, challenging the other patrons. "Look around, old man. Nobody's gonna stick their neck out for you." His hand emerged, clutching a switchblade that he flicked open with a theatrical snap. Light glinted off the polished steel, drawing gasps from the other diners. At a corner booth, a trucker with a weathered face shifted uncomfortably, his coffee forgotten. Near the window, a family with two young children quietly gathered their belongings, trying to slip away unnoticed. Across the room, a young waitress froze mid-step, her tray trembling in her hands, water glasses clinking softly. An older man near the door, perhaps a retired teacher by his look, seemed about to intervene but thought better of it, retreating back into his chair. The cafe owner, a wiry man in his 60s named Tom Harris, stepped out from behind the counter, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Hey, come on now, fellas. No need for this." "Shut it, old man," barked the smaller biker, his knife flashing as he waved it threateningly. "Stay out of this unless you want trouble too." The threat hung heavy in the air, mixing with the lingering scent of fresh coffee and fear. Marcus adjusted his footing with subtle precision, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly. It was a stance that anyone trained in close-quarters combat would recognize, a preparation for explosive movement. "Walk away now," he said again, his voice carrying the steel edge of command. "This isn't going to end well for you." The tension in the room thickened like smoke. The bikers laughed, oblivious to the change in Marcus's demeanor, blind to the coiled strength beneath his calm exterior. "Make us," the taller one sneered, lunging forward with the clumsy aggression of a bar fighter. And then, like lightning unleashed, Marcus moved. The taller biker's world spun as Marcus grabbed his extended arm, using the man's own momentum against him. In one fluid motion, Marcus twisted, his hip becoming a pivot point as he executed a perfect throw. The biker sailed through the air, his surprise evident in his strangled yelp, before crashing onto an empty table. With splintered, dishes shattered, and coffee splashed across the floor. The smaller biker hesitated, his knife hand wavering. That split second of indecision was all Marcus needed. He closed the distance in 2 precise steps, his movements economical and purposeful. His left hand clamped down on the biker's knife wrist, applying pressure to specific nerve points while his right hand struck like a cobra, targeting the solar plexus. The knife clattered to the floor as the biker doubled over, gasping. "You broke my table," the cafe owner shouted, more from reflex than actual concern about the furniture. Marcus maintained his grip on the smaller biker, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Sorry about the mess, Tom. Send me the bill." He turned his attention back to his opponent. "Now, about that peaceful exit I mentioned?" The taller biker was struggling to his feet, shards of broken plate sliding off his leather jacket. Blood trickled from a small cut above his eye, and his earlier bravado had transformed into pure rage. "You're dead, Marine. You hear me? Dead." He reached behind his back, and several patrons ducked, expecting a weapon. Instead of a gun, he pulled out a phone. "Yeah, boss." He growled into it, eyes locked on Marcus. "We got a situation at the Crossroads Café. Some ex-Marine thinks he's a hero." He listened for a moment, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Yeah, we'll handle it." The smaller biker, still wheezing, managed to straighten up. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, old man. The steel vultures don't forget, and we don't forgive." Marcus released him with a small shove, his stance still ready. "Neither do Marines." The bikers backed toward the door, maintaining eye contact. "This ain't over," the taller one spat, blood dripping onto his collar. "Not by a long shot. You just started a war." As their motorcycles roared to life outside, the cafe erupted into nervous chatter. The waitress approached Marcus with a fresh cup of coffee, her hands still shaking slightly. "That was amazing," she said, setting the cup down. "But those guys, they're serious trouble. The steel vultures practically own the north side of town." Marcus took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Then maybe it's time somebody changed that." The cafe owner joined them, surveying the damage. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "And next time, they'll bring friends." Marcus nodded, already calculating possibilities and strategies. His quiet retirement had just become a lot more complicated. "I know," he said simply, "and I'll be ready." Outside, thunder rumbled across the sky, as if nature itself was acknowledging the storm that was coming. The steel vultures had just challenged the wrong Marine, and Marcus Reed had never been one to back down from a fight, especially when innocent people were counting on him. Word of the confrontation spread through the small town like wildfire. By sunset, the Crossroads Café had become ground zero for speculation and whispered conversations. Local patrons clustered in booths, sharing their versions of events, each retelling making Marcus's actions more legendary than the last. The sheriff, a man named Jim Cooper who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, arrived an hour after the incident. He stood in the cafe's doorway, taking in the scattered debris and the nervous energy still crackling through the air. His weathered face creased with concern as Tom Harris recounted the events. "Steel vultures, huh?" Cooper shook his head, thumbs hooked in his belt loops. "They've been pushing into towns all along the interstate. Started with protection rackets in Miller's Creek, then moved on to worse things in Cedar Junction. We've been waiting for them to make a move here." Marcus sat at his usual spot, now surrounded by broken glass and splintered wood. "They mentioned a boss," he said, his voice low enough that only Cooper could hear. Sounded like they're organized. Cooper pulled up a stool, his badge catching the afternoon light. That'd be Jake, the Snake Donovan. Ex-military himself, dishonorable discharge. Built the Steel Vultures from nothing into one of the most dangerous gangs in 3 states. He's got a special hatred for anyone who served with honor. The cafe had emptied except for a few regulars who seemed reluctant to leave. Among them was Mike Townsend, the trucker who'd witnessed the whole thing. He approached Marcus and Cooper, his massive frame casting a shadow across the counter. "Those boys will be back," Townsend said, adjusting his cap. "I haul through Miller's Creek regular. Seen what they did to folks who stood up to them. It ain't pretty." Marcus absorbed this information with the same calm he'd shown during the fight. "They're used to people backing down," he observed. "That's about a change." Sarah, the young waitress, emerged from the kitchen with a broom and dustpan. Her hands had stopped shaking, replaced by a determined set to her jaw. "My brother owns the hardware store down the street," she said, sweeping up broken dishes. "Last month, 2 bikers came in talking about insurance payments. He told them to get lost, and the next day his store windows were smashed." Cooper stood, adjusting his gun belt. "I'll increase patrols, but I'm short-staffed as it is. They know how to work around law enforcement." "Then we work around them," Marcus said, his voice carrying that quiet authority that made others listen. "They prey on isolated targets, people who can't fight back. So we changed the equation." Tom Harris emerged from his office, carrying a stack of papers. "Already called my insurance company," he said, but his expression suggested he had more on his mind than property damage. "But maybe it's time we did more than just file claims and replace windows." The late afternoon sun slanted through the cafe windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Outside, traffic moved along the interstate as usual, but inside the Crossroads Cafe, something was shifting. The air felt charged with possibility and determination. Marcus stood, placing a 20 on the counter despite Tom's protests. "First thing they'll do is try to isolate us," he said, military training evident in his analysis. "They'll watch, probe for weaknesses, try to scare people into staying away. Standard intimidation tactics." "So, what do we do?" Sarah asked, pausing in her cleanup efforts. Marcus looked around the cafe, taking in the concerned faces, the broken furniture, the community that had welcomed him after his retirement. His response was simple, but carried the weight of experience and resolve. "We stand together. And we show them that this town isn't as soft a target as they think." As he walked out into the gathering dusk, Marcus could feel the weight of what was coming. The Steel Vultures had made a critical error in judgment. They thought they'd found another easy mark, another quiet town to bend to their will. Instead, they'd awakened a warrior who understood something they didn't. True strength isn't found in causing fear, but in standing against it. The rumble of distant motorcycles echoed faintly from the highway, a reminder that the real battle was just beginning. But for the first time in years, Marcus felt the familiar surge of purpose, the clarity that came with having a mission worth fighting for. The Steel Vultures wanted a war. They were about to learn what happens when you pick a fight with a Marine who's found something worth protecting. The news spread through town channels faster than any social media could manage. By morning, Marcus's phone was buzzing with calls from local business owners, each with their own Steel Vulture story. The hardware store owner had security footage of suspicious figures casing his shop. The local mechanic reported threatening visits, thinly veiled demands for protection money. Each call reinforced what Marcus already knew. The cafe incident was just the tip of the iceberg. Tom Harris opened the cafe early, the pre-dawn darkness still clinging to the windows. He found Marcus already there, sitting at his usual spot, now marked by a fresh coat of paint and repaired floorboards. The morning regulars trickled in, their usual routines carrying an undercurrent of tension. The bell above the door chimed, and heads turned as Sheriff Cooper entered, followed by a tall, muscular man in his 30s. The stranger's bearing screamed military, from his perfect posture to his alert eyes scanning the room. "Sergeant Reed," the man said, snapping to attention. "Corporal Ryan Martinez, sir. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines." Marcus stood, recognition flickering across his face. At ease, Corporal. Long way from Fallujah. Martinez broke into a grin, extending his hand. Got out last year. Been working private security in Denver. Sheriff Cooper called, said you might need some backup. Cooper nodded, looking pleased with himself. Martinez here was top of his class in tactical response. Figured you two might have some catching up to do. The cafe filled with the morning crowd, but this time it was different. Instead of the usual scattered seating, people clustered together, conversations hushed but purposeful. Mike Townsend had parked his rig outside, its massive presence like a sentinel guarding the lot. He'd brought friends, other truckers who'd had run-ins with the steel vultures along their routes. Sarah worked the morning shift, moving between tables with fresh coffee and determined efficiency. Her brother James, the hardware store owner, sat at the counter, spreading out blueprints of the town's main street. They've been watching delivery patterns, he explained, pointing to marked locations. Every business that's refused them has had accidents within 48 hours. Marcus and Martinez studied the patterns, their military training transforming civilian streets into tactical terrain. Tom Harris joined them, wiping his hands on his apron. Got some interesting calls this morning, he said quietly. Seems word got out about yesterday. Other towns are watching, waiting to see if someone finally stands up to these thugs. Martinez traced the delivery routes with his finger. They're organized, I'll give them that, but they're used to soft targets. Change the equation, change the outcome. The morning light strengthened, casting long shadows through the windows. Outside, more vehicles began filling the parking lot. Pickup trucks, work vans, even a few motorcycles belonging to legitimate riders. The Crossroads Café was becoming something more than a restaurant. It was becoming a command center. Marcus watched the gathering crowd, feeling a familiar sense of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. These weren't soldiers, but they were ready to fight for their community. They just needed someone to show them how. First thing, he said, addressing the growing group, we need to understand what we're dealing with. Knowledge is power, and right now, they think they know more about us than we know about them. Let's change that. By mid-morning, the cafe had transformed into an impromptu war room. James had connected his laptop to a small projector, displaying Google Maps of the area on the wall. Red pins marked known steel vultures incidents, creating a disturbing pattern of escalating violence radiating outward from their suspected base of operations. They're methodical, Martinez observed, standing beside Marcus. Start with small businesses, then work their way up to larger targets. By the time they control the commerce, they've got the whole town by the throat. A new face pushed through the crowd, Linda Chen, owner of the local pharmacy. Her usually immaculate business suit was wrinkled, her eyes tired but determined. They came last night, she announced, silencing the room. 2 of them. Said they were concerned about my inventory security. Offered protection for a reasonable fee. Marcus's jaw tightened. What did you tell them? Linda's smile was razor sharp. That my security system records in high definition and the police response time to my shop is under 3 minutes. They left, but... She pulled out her phone, showing pictures of slashed tires in her parking lot. They're sending a message, Cooper said, examining the photos. Testing responses, looking for weak points. The cafe door chimed again, admitting an unexpected ally. David Wong, the local high school's IT teacher, carried a stack of laptops under his arm. Heard you could use some tech support, he said, setting up his equipment. These guys might be tough on the streets, but they're sloppy online. Social media, payment apps, they leave digital footprints everywhere. Marcus watched as the community continued to gather strength. Each person brought something unique, knowledge, resources, skills that could turn the tide. Tom Harris had converted the cafe's back office into a makeshift communication hub, installing extra phone lines and a police scanner borrowed from a retired deputy. Sarah organized a group of waitresses and shop workers into an informal intelligence network. We see everything, she explained. People talk around us like we're invisible. The vultures won't expect us to be watching. Mike Townsend and his trucker friends had their own contribution. Got CB radios in every rig, he said, spreading out a map marked with their regular routes. Any vulture movement on the highways will know about it. The atmosphere in the cafe had changed. Fear was giving way to purpose, isolation to unity. Martinez pulled Marcus aside, his expression serious. "This is bigger than just one town, sir. If we can stop them here, we create a blueprint," Marcus finished. "Show other communities they can fight back." As the sun climbed higher, more allies arrived. A construction foreman offered his crew and equipment. The owner of the local gym, a former boxer, volunteered to teach basic self-defense classes. Even the quiet librarian had valuable intelligence about the gang's activities in neighboring counties. Tom Harris watched it all from behind his counter, a proud smile on his weathered face. "Never seen anything like this," he said to Marcus. 20 years running this place, I thought I knew everyone. But this..." He gestured to the diverse group working together. "This is something special." Marcus nodded, but his mind was already moving ahead, planning, strategizing. The steel vultures had a fatal mistake. They'd built their power on the assumption that ordinary people would always choose fear over resistance. But they'd never faced a community united under the leadership of someone who understood both the art of war and the power of unity. Outside, the summer heat shimmered off the pavement, but inside the Crossroads Café, a different kind of heat was building, the fierce determination of people who decided that enough was enough. The battle lines were being drawn, not by soldiers, but by teachers, truckers, waitresses, and shop owners. And at their center, a Marine who'd found a new mission worth fighting for. Would you like me to continue with the next part of Section 4? As evening approached, the cafe's transformation was complete. The regular dinner crowd mixed with the newly formed resistance, creating an atmosphere that hummed with quiet determination. Tom Harris had kept the coffee flowing all day, refusing payment from anyone involved in the planning. An unexpected ally arrived just before sunset. Father Michael from St. Augustine's Church, his collar a stark white against his black shirt. "The steel vultures paid me a visit this morning," he said, pulling up a chair next to Marcus. "Suggested our donation box might need protection." His gentle face hardened. "They also mentioned our youth center might have an unfortunate accident." Martinez's fist tightened around his coffee cup. "They're targeting a church now?" "They're targeting everything that brings people together," Marcus observed. "Churches, cafes, community centers. They want to isolate people, break down the connections that make a community strong." David Wong looked up from his laptop, where he'd been analyzing gang activity patterns. "Got something interesting here. Their financial transactions, they're using a local bank to launder money. Small deposits, different accounts, but all following the same pattern." Linda Chen leaned over his shoulder, her business acumen spotting details others might miss. "These timestamps, they're coordinating their deposits with the bank's shift changes. Someone on the inside must be helping them." The revelation sparked a fresh wave of discussion. James pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. "My cousin works at that bank. Let me make a call." Sarah appeared with fresh coffee and a stack of sandwiches. "You all need to eat," she insisted, her maternal tone brooking no argument. As she distributed the food, she shared what she'd learned from her own intelligence gathering. "The morning waitress at the truck stop near their compound says they're bringing in more bikes. At least 20 new members in the past week." Marcus absorbed this information, watching the various groups working together. The truckers had synchronized their routes to maintain constant surveillance of major roads. David's tech team had set up a secure communication network using encrypted messaging apps. The gym owner had already started basic self-defense classes in the parking lot. Tom Harris approached Marcus, his face serious. "Got a call from Pete's Diner over in Miller's Creek. They heard what we're doing here. Want to know if we can help them set up something similar." Marcus shared a look with Martinez. "The steel vultures wanted to make an example of us. Looks like they're going to get their wish, just not the way they planned." As night fell, the cafe remained lit like a beacon. Through the windows, passers-by could see groups hunched over maps and laptops, planning and preparing. The message was clear. This town would not go quietly. Father Michael stood to leave, pausing by Marcus's chair. You know, Sergeant, when I first came to this town, I worried it had lost its soul to progress and isolation. People didn't know their neighbors anymore. He gestured to the unified crowd. I never imagined it would take something like this to bring it back. Marcus watched the priest leave, understanding the truth in his words. The steel vultures had meant to break this community through fear. Instead, they'd given it a reason to remember its strength. The night ahead would be long, filled with preparation and planning. But looking at the determined faces around him, Marcus felt a surge of pride. These weren't soldiers. They were something perhaps even more formidable. Ordinary people who decided that their community was worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in the warmth of the Crossroads Café, hope felt as tangible as the coffee cups and battle plans scattered across the tables. The real victory, Marcus realized, wasn't just in standing up to the steel vultures, it was in rediscovering what community truly meant. The steel vultures made their first move 3 days later. It started with the sound of motorcycles in the pre-dawn darkness, dozens of them circling the town like wolves sizing up their prey. Marcus stood on his front porch, counting the distinctive rumbles. At least 30 bikes, more than local law enforcement could handle. Sheriff Cooper's cruiser pulled up Marcus's driveway at first light, kicking up gravel. His face was grim as he stepped out. They've surrounded the town, got roadblocks on every major intersection leading to the highway. They're not letting any trucks through. Marcus nodded, having expected something like this. Cutting off supplies. Classic siege tactic. That's not all, Cooper continued, his voice tight. Got reports of their people watching schools, following kids home. No direct threats yet, but the message is clear. Inside Marcus's house, the secure phone line they'd installed started ringing. Martinez answered it, his expression darkening as he listened. Sir, they've started showing up at businesses. Teams of 4 or 5, demanding protection payments. They're giving people until sundown to comply. Marcus checked his watch. The cafe would be opening soon, and he knew it would be their first target. Tom Harris had refused to close, insisting that showing fear was exactly what the vultures wanted. Time to implement Phase 1, Marcus said, reaching for his jacket. The plan they developed was simple but effective. Each business had been equipped with silent alarms connected to their improvised command center. Video cameras, supplied by David Wong's tech team, had been strategically placed throughout town. Most importantly, every shop owner and worker had been trained in basic security protocols. Marcus climbed into Cooper's cruiser, and they headed toward Main Street. The morning fog was just lifting, revealing clusters of motorcycles parked at strategic points throughout town. Their riders, leather-clad and menacing, watched the cruiser pass with predatory interest. They're trying to intimidate us, Cooper observed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. They're also showing us their numbers and positions, Marcus replied, mentally mapping their locations. Overconfidence makes people sloppy. They pulled up to the Crossroads Café just as Tom Harris was unlocking the front door. The parking lot was unusually full, truckers who'd coordinated their schedules to be in town, local business owners gathering for their morning coffee, and a few faces Marcus recognized as former military from neighboring counties. Inside, the cafe hummed with nervous energy. Sarah moved between tables, serving coffee with one hand while keeping her phone ready to activate the alert system with the other. The usual morning chatter was subdued, replaced by watchful silence. The bell above the door chimed at exactly 7:30. 4 Steel Vultures members swaggered in, led by a tall man with a snake tattoo coiling up his neck. The cafe went quiet, all eyes watching as they approached the counter where Tom stood. Heard you've been having some trouble lately, Snake Tattoo said, his voice carrying artificial concern. Broken furniture, damaged property. Dangerous world out there. He placed a crisp business card on the counter. We're offering a reasonable insurance policy. Guarantee nothing bad happens to your nice establishment. Tom picked up the card, examined it, then deliberately tore it in half. I've already got insurance, thanks. Good company too, been with them 20 years. Snake Tattoo's friendly demeanor vanished. You're making a mistake, old man. Bad things happen to people who don't appreciate our generosity. That sounded like a threat. Marcus's voice cut through the tension as he stood up from his booth. Want to rephrase that? Snake Tattoo turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Marcus. Well, if it isn't the hero Marine. Been hearing about you. His hand drifted toward his jacket pocket. Boss sends his regards. The cafe's atmosphere shifted instantly. Throughout the room, truckers and veterans casually adjusted their positions. Mike Townsend's massive frame filled the doorway, while Martinez quietly moved to cover the rear exit. They'd practiced this, prepared for it, but the tension still crackled like electricity. Your boss, Marcus said calmly, stepping forward. Jake Donovan, right? Funny thing about dishonorable discharges, they leave a paper trail. We've been doing our homework. That hit a nerve. Snake Tattoo's face twisted with rage. You don't know what you're dealing with, old man. This ain't some war zone where you can play hero. This is business. Business. Tom's voice rang out, steady and clear. Let's talk business then. He reached under the counter and pulled out a thick folder. Got some interesting documents here. Bank records, police reports, witness statements from 3 counties. Amazing what people will share when they're not scared anymore. One of the other vultures, a shorter man with a scarred face, moved toward Tom, but stopped short when he noticed the reds of laser sights dancing across his chest. David Wong's security system was working perfectly. Those ain't cops, Snake Tattoo growled, noticing similars on his own jacket. No, Marcus agreed. Just concerned citizens. See, your boss made a mistake. He thought fear only worked one way. But when people get scared enough for their families, their homes, their community, well, they stop being victims and start getting creative. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles grew louder. More vultures were arriving, drawn by some signal from their companions inside. Through the windows, Marcus could see them forming a perimeter around the cafe. You really want to do this? Snake Tattoo's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. We got 50 guys out there. You've got what? Some truckers and old vets playing soldier? Marcus stepped closer, his voice pitched for Snake Tattoo's ears alone. You've got numbers. We've got something better, a reason to fight. Look around. Really look. These people aren't scared anymore. They're angry. And they've spent the last 3 days learning exactly how to handle people like you. As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance. Not just local police, but state troopers. Cooper's connections had come through. Above them, a news helicopter appeared, its camera trained on the scene. Linda Chen's media contacts were right on schedule. Snake Tattoo's confidence wavered as he realized the trap they'd walked into. His hand moved from his pocket, empty. This ain't over, he snarled, backing toward the door. Not by a long shot. Actually, Marcus replied, it is. You just don't know it yet. The vultures retreated, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Outside, their companions revved their engines in a show of defiance, but the sound was hollow now, stripped of its power to intimidate. As the last motorcycle roared away, the cafe erupted in tension-breaking cheers. But Marcus and his core team knew better. This wasn't a victory, it was just the opening move in a larger game. The steel vultures had been humiliated, and that made them more dangerous than ever. Tom Harris appeared at Marcus's side, his face serious. They'll be back. With more men. Marcus nodded, watching the dust settle on the street. Yes. But now they know we're ready. And that changes everything. The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through the town like shockwaves. By noon, the steel vultures had withdrawn to their compound, but their presence lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. Marcus gathered his core team in the cafe's back office, now transformed into a proper command center with monitors showing feeds from David's security cameras. They're regrouping at the old Miller factory, Martinez reported, pointing to satellite imagery on his laptop. Traffic cameras caught at least 30 more bikes heading that way in the last hour. Linda Chen arrived with fresh intel from her pharmacy's security system. They've pulled their watchers from most locations, but they're still monitoring key intersections. Something's changed in their pattern. Marcus studied the footage, noting the vultures' altered behavior. They're adapting. Snake Tattoo will report our preparations to Donovan. They'll come back with a different strategy. Sheriff Cooper entered, his face etched with concern. Just got off the phone with state police. They're sending support, but it'll take time to coordinate. Meanwhile, we've got reports of vultures attacking supply trucks headed for neighboring towns. They're trying to isolate us. The news sparked urgent discussions around the room. Tom Harris spread out a map marked with their supply routes and alternatives. We've got enough stored supplies for a week, maybe 2. After that, they're trying to starve us out, Martinez concluded. Classic siege tactics. Sarah burst in, her phone in hand. Just got word from my contact at the truck stop. Overheard some vultures talking. They're calling in members from other chapters. Something about making an example of us. Marcus absorbed this information, his military training kicking in. The steel vultures were shifting from intimidation to actual warfare. They'd been humiliated, and now they wanted blood. Sir, Martinez said quietly, we might have won this morning, but we got lucky. They weren't prepared for resistance. Next time they'll come in force, Marcus finished. He turned to David Wong. How's our communication network? David looked up from his array of screens. Secure and expanding. Got 10 more businesses hooked into our alert system today alone. But there's something else. He pulled up a series of social media posts. Word's getting out. Other towns are watching what we're doing here. Some are starting to organize their own resistance. That news carried weight. The steel vultures' power had always relied on isolation and fear. If their intimidation tactics failed here, their whole operation could unravel. Father Michael arrived as evening approached, his usual calm demeanor marked with urgency. They visited the church again, he reported. Different approach this time. Offered a donation to our youth program. Said they want to be part of the community. Trying to divide us, Marcus observed. Turn this into a debate about acceptance versus resistance. The priest nodded. Some of my congregation are already questioning whether we should negotiate. Fear is giving way to doubt. Marcus stood, addressing the room. That's their real weapon, not violence, but doubt. They want us questioning ourselves, each other. We need to shore up morale. Tom Harris stepped forward. The cafe's hosting a town meeting tonight. Every business owner, every community leader. Time to remind people what we're fighting for. As the sun set, Marcus watched the town from the cafe's window. On the surface, everything looked normal. Shops closing, people heading home, street lights flickering on. But beneath that normalcy, he could feel the current of tension, the awareness that everything had changed. The steel vultures had revealed their true nature, and in doing so, had revealed something else, the strength of a community united against them. But unity, Marcus knew, was fragile. The real test wouldn't be in firefights or standoffs, but in maintaining that solidarity in the face of fear, doubt, and the long shadow of violence to come. Tonight, they'd celebrate their small victory. Tomorrow, they'd prepare for the real battle. The steel vultures wouldn't take this defeat lightly, and Marcus intended to be ready when they returned. The war for the soul of the town was just beginning. Marcus sat alone in his darkened living room, cleaning his old service pistol by muscle memory. The house was quiet except for the distant rumble of motorcycles, a sound that had become constant in the town, like an endless thunder-threatening storm. On his coffee table lay a worn photograph. Younger Marcus in desert camo, surrounded by his Marine unit in Afghanistan. A knock at the door broke his reverie. Martinez stood on the porch, holding a manila envelope. Found something you need to see, sir. Inside the envelope were photographs and documents about Jake Donovan, the Steel Vultures leader. Marcus spread them across his kitchen table, pieces of a puzzle he'd been trying to solve. Service records, court-martials, newspaper clippings about mysterious deaths. He was force recon, Martinez said quietly. Same time you were in Fallujah. Marcus picked up a faded photograph showing a younger Donovan receiving a commendation. I remember him. Different name then. His unit was tasked with protecting supply convoys. Until they started losing shipments to insurgents. Inside job. Marcus nodded. By the time they caught on, 3 good men were dead. Donovan disappeared before the court-martial. Everyone thought he'd fled the country. Martinez settled into a chair, his expression troubled. Now he's building his own private army, using the same tactics he learned in the Corps but twisted, corrupted. The revelation hit Marcus harder than he expected. Donovan wasn't just another criminal. He was a betrayal of everything the Corps stood for. Every value Marcus had lived by, every principle he'd fought to uphold, Donovan had perverted for his own gain. "Sir," Martinez hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Some of the town council members are getting nervous. There's talk about negotiating, finding a compromise." Marcus stood, moving to his window. Outside, the street was empty, but he could see lights on in neighboring houses. Families were staying up late, watching, waiting. "You know what Donovan will do if we back down? Same thing he did in Miller's Creek. Take control piece by piece until there's nothing left." A memory surfaced. Marcus's last firefight in Fallujah. His unit pinned down, civilians caught in the crossfire. He'd made a choice that day, one that earned him a silver star but cost him nights of peaceful sleep. "I came here looking for quiet," Marcus said, more to himself than Martinez. "Thought I was done fighting." Martinez stood, facing his former commander. "Maybe that's why you're here, sir. Because sometimes the fights that matter most aren't the ones we choose. They're the ones that choose us." The distant rumble of motorcycles grew louder, then faded. Somewhere in town, the steel vultures were watching, planning. Marcus looked again at the photograph of his unit, remembering faces of men who'd given everything to protect what they believed in. "You know what the hardest part of leadership is, Ryan?" Marcus turned from the window. "It's not making decisions. It's living with them. Every choice carries weight, consequences." Martinez leaned forward, his voice soft but urgent. "The town's watching you, sir. Not just because you're taking a stand, but because you remind them of something they'd forgotten, that one person can make a difference." Marcus picked up Donovan's service photo again. "We took the same oath, served the same flag." Somewhere along the line, he forgot what that meant. He placed the photo back on the table. Or maybe he never really understood it at all. A text message lit up Marcus's phone. "Sarah from the cafe." Another Steel Vultures patrol had passed through town, this time stopping to photograph houses with children's toys in the yards. The implied threat was clear. "They're escalating," Martinez observed. "Using fear of family harm. That's a new tactic for them." Marcus's jaw tightened. He reached for a leather-bound notebook on a shelf, its pages worn with use. Inside were names, dates, locations, a record of every Marine under his command, including those who didn't make it home. "In Fallujah," he began, his voice distant with memory, "we had this saying, 'The only easy day was yesterday.'" But that wasn't really true. There were no easy days, just choices we could live with and choices we couldn't. He opened the notebook to a particular page, where a metal citation was carefully preserved. "Remember Staff Sergeant Collins?" Martinez nodded solemnly. "The school incident. Never forgot it. We were clearing buildings when we found them, local kids being used as shields by insurgents. Collins talked them down, got every child out safely. Cost him his life." Marcus traced the citation with his finger. He made a choice that day. The kind of choice that defines who you are. Standing, Marcus moved to a locked cabinet in his study. Inside was his dress uniform, medals still pinned perfectly in place. The silver star caught the dim light, a reminder of both honor and burden. "You know what I've been thinking about lately?" He carefully closed the cabinet. All those training exercises, all those combat situations, they weren't just about winning fights. They were about protecting something bigger than ourselves. A commotion outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see emergency lights flashing several blocks away. Marcus's phone buzzed again. The hardware store's silent alarm had been triggered. "They're testing our response times," Marcus said, already reaching for his jacket. "Probing for weaknesses." But before they could leave, another visitor arrived, Tom Harris, looking more troubled than Marcus had ever seen him. "Got something you need to hear," he said, entering without ceremony. "Just had a visit from Jake Donovan himself." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus gestured for Tom to continue. He was different than I expected. Polite. Professional. Offered to buy the cafe outright. Said he'd keep me on as manager. Tom's hands were shaking slightly. Talked about progress, economic development. Made it sound reasonable. That's how it starts, Marcus said quietly. They make it sound like business, like progress. By the time people realize what they've lost, it's too late. The emergency lights were still flashing in the distance. Reminder that the night's trials weren't over. But something had shifted in Marcus's demeanor, a certainty, a purpose that hadn't been there before. Tom, he said, what did you tell him? Told him the cafe wasn't for sale. That some things matter more than money. Tom straightened his shoulders. Told him I learned that from a Marine who bothers to learn everyone's coffee order and always leaves a good tip. Marcus allowed himself a small smile, remembering all the mornings spent in that cafe, watching the town wake up, becoming part of its rhythm. He'd chosen this place for its quiet, its simplicity. Now he would fight for it, not because he had to, but because he couldn't imagine doing anything else. The emergency lights continued to flash, calling them to action. But as they prepared to respond, Marcus felt a clarity he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. Some battles weren't about winning or losing. They were about standing up for what you believed in, no matter the cost. Tonight, he would make choices he could live with. Tomorrow would take care of itself. Dawn found Marcus and his team assessing the night's damage. The hardware store's windows were intact. The alarm had been a feint, meant to divide their attention. But the real target had been the town's communication infrastructure. Several cell towers had been damaged, and key internet nodes were offline. They're isolating us, David Wong explained, frantically working on backup systems. Cutting us off from outside help. Marcus watched the sunrise from the cafe's roof, where they'd established a makeshift observation post. The morning light revealed small changes in the town, more shuttered windows, fewer people on the streets. Fear was creeping back in, subtle but persistent. Father Michael joined him on the roof, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Interesting sermon I'm preparing for Sunday, he said, handing Marcus a cup. About David and Goliath. Though these days, I'm thinking more about Moses leading his people through the wilderness. Trying to find meaning in all this? The priest smiled gently. Actually, I'm thinking about you, Marcus. About why you're really fighting. Before Marcus could respond, Martinez burst through the roof access door. Sir, you need to see this. He held up his tablet, showing a live stream from a local news station. Jake Donovan was giving an interview, looking polished and professional in a business suit. Concerned about the escalating tensions in this peaceful community, Donovan was saying smoothly, our organization has always been about economic development and mutual prosperity. These accusations of intimidation are unfortunate misunderstandings. Marcus watched the performance with growing unease. Donovan was playing a different game now, trying to turn public opinion, paint himself as a reasonable businessman facing unreasonable resistance. He's good, Father Michael observed, offering people an easy way out, a chance to believe this was all a misunderstanding. The priest's words struck something in Marcus's memory. Another time, another place where he'd seen good people tempted by easy answers. He remembered a village in Afghanistan, a local elder who'd chosen to stand against the Taliban despite the personal cost. You know what that elder told me? Marcus said quietly. He said courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about knowing what matters more than fear. Below them, the town was coming awake. Marcus could see Sarah opening the cafe, Tom preparing for the morning rush. Linda Chun was unlocking her pharmacy, and James was sweeping broken glass from his hardware store's sidewalk. Regular people doing regular things, refusing to be cowed. I've been thinking about what you asked, Marcus told the priest. About why I'm fighting. It's not about Donovan, or even about stopping the steel vultures. He gestured to the town below. It's about them. About showing them that they don't have to live in fear. That standing together matters more than standing down. Martinez's tablet chimed with new alerts. More steel vultures were gathering at their compound. Donovan's peaceful overtures on TV wouldn't match his actions on the ground. You know what's coming, Father Michael said. It wasn't a question. Marcus nodded, finishing his coffee. They'll try to break us. Not just physically, but spiritually. Make us doubt ourselves, each other. Make us question whether resistance is worth the cost. The morning sun had fully risen now, painting the town in shades of gold. From the roof, Marcus could see people gathering in small groups, checking on neighbors, sharing news and support. The steel vultures had meant to tear the community apart, but they'd only succeeded in bringing it closer together. I spent years after Fallujah looking for peace, Marcus said finally. Came here thinking I could leave the fighting behind. But maybe peace isn't about avoiding conflict. Maybe it's about knowing what you're willing to fight for. He stood, his decision made. The time for doubt was over. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same clarity of purpose that had guided him through war zones and firefights. But this time, he wasn't fighting for a distant cause or a flag. He was fighting for something he could see right in front of him, a community worth protecting, people worth standing beside. The battle ahead would test them all. But looking out over the town he'd come to call home, Marcus knew he'd already won the most important fight, the one within himself. The steel vultures struck at midnight. Not with the roar of motorcycles this time, but with silence. The town's power grid went dark sector by sector, streets falling into shadow like dominoes. In the cafe's command center, now running on backup generators, Marcus watched the security feeds with growing tension. They're moving in from all directions, Martinez reported, tracking multiple heat signatures on their thermal imaging equipment. At least 60 bikes, maybe more. They've got vehicles too, trucks and vans. David Wong's fingers flew across his keyboard, coordinating their response teams. Communications are holding for now, but they're hitting our backup systems hard. We've got maybe an hour before we lose the network completely. Marcus studied the tactical display, noting the steel vultures formation. This wasn't just an attack, it was a carefully planned operation. Donovan was applying military precision to gang warfare. They're hurting people, Marcus observed, seeing the pattern emerge, cutting off escape routes, forcing everyone toward the town center. Sheriff Cooper burst in, his uniform dusty from riding patrol. They've blocked all major roads. Got reports of armed men going door to door in the outer neighborhoods, telling people to gather for their own safety in the town square. The cafe's back room had become a fortress of sorts. Local volunteers manned communication stations, coordinating with their network of lookouts. Tom Harris moved between them, distributing coffee and maintaining morale with quiet determination. "Sir," Martinez said softly, pointing to a particular thermal signature moving with purpose through the darkness. "That's got to be Donovan. The way they're moving, protecting that position." Marcus nodded. He's coming to make a statement. Wants to be seen taking control personally. A new alert flashed across their screens, the church's silent alarm. Father Michael's voice crackled over their secure channel. "They're gathering people here. Families, children. Using the sanctuary as a holding area." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Using a church as a staging ground, it was exactly the kind of psychological warfare Donovan excelled at. Force people to gather in a place of sanctuary, then turn that sanctuary into a prison. "How many?" Marcus asked. "At least 100, the priest replied. "They're being polite about it, saying it's for our protection during a temporary police action. But they're armed, Marcus. And they're not letting anyone leave." Sarah appeared at Marcus's side, her face pale but determined. "Just got word from my brother. They're doing the same thing at the school gymnasium, separating families, telling people it's just until they can restore order." The pieces clicked into place. Donovan wasn't just trying to take the town, he was staging a coup, complete with manufactured crisis and promised resolution. He'd present himself as the solution to the very chaos he'd created. Marcus turned to his core team. "This ends tonight, one way or another." His voice carried the weight of command, of decisions that couldn't be undone. "We've got people in place?" Martinez nodded. "Ready on your signal." Everyone knows their part. Outside, the darkness was almost complete, broken only by the occasional sweep of flashlights as steel vultures patrolled the streets. But in that darkness, Marcus knew, their own forces were moving into position. Regular people turned warriors, shopkeepers become soldiers, all fighting for something bigger than themselves. The time for preparation was over. Now it was about execution, about turning all their planning and training into action. Marcus checked his watch, knowing that across town, others were doing the same. "Send the signal," he ordered. "Let's show them what this town is really made of." The signal rippled through the darkness, not with lights or sound, but with action. Across town, doors and windows that had appeared dark and abandoned suddenly revealed their secrets. The steel vultures had expected to find a cowering population. Instead, they found resistance at every turn. From the hardware store's roof, James and his employees launched a barrage of industrial fireworks, precisely aimed to disorient the bikers patrolling the streets. The sudden explosions of light and sound sent motorcycles swerving, their formations breaking apart in confusion. At the church, Father Michael's congregation executed their own plan. As the vultures herded people inside, no one noticed the steady stream of families being led through the old Prohibition-era tunnel beneath the altar, emerging safely in the basement of Linda Chen's pharmacy 3 blocks away. "They've spotted the diversions," Martinez reported, watching the thermal feeds. "Donovan's redirecting forces to the north side." Marcus nodded. "Just like we planned, David." Wong's fingers danced across his keyboard. Executing Phase 2. Suddenly, every car alarm in the downtown parking lot began blaring in unison. In the confusion, the steel vultures didn't notice the real threat. Mike Townsend and his fellow truckers had positioned their rigs strategically around the town's perimeter, and now they moved in concert, their massive vehicles blocking key intersections and trapping dozens of bikers in tactical boxes. "They're splitting up," Martinez observed, losing their cohesion. Marcus watched as Donovan's carefully planned operation began to fragment. The steel vultures had expected to find sheep ready for slaughter. Instead, they'd walked into a trap laid by wolves. Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "Group 3 in position. We've got eyes on their command vehicle." Through the security feeds, Marcus could see Donovan emerging from a black SUV, his face contorted with rage as his plans unraveled. He was shouting orders, trying to regain control of the chaos. "Sir," Martinez said urgently, "he's heading for the cafe, bringing his core team with him." Marcus checked his weapon, then looked at each member of his team. "Remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone they've ever terrorized, everyone who thought they couldn't fight back." The cafe's lights suddenly blazed to life, their backup generator humming steadily. In the harsh fluorescent glare, Marcus could see Donovan and his men approaching, their shadows stretching long across the empty street. "You've lost, Jake," Marcus called out, his voice carrying in the night air. "Your men are scattered. The state police are on their way. It's over." Donovan's laugh was cold and sharp. "Over? This is just beginning, Reed. You think these people will thank you when their town burns? When their businesses are destroyed? When their children have to live with the consequences of your heroics?" "The only consequences they'll have to live with," Marcus replied, "are the ones that come from standing up to bullies like you." For a moment, the two men locked eyes across the distance, both Marines, both leaders, but fighting for very different causes. Then Donovan drew his weapon, and the night erupted into chaos. The final battle for the soul of the town had begun. Gunfire shattered the cafe's front windows, sending glass raining down like deadly crystals. Marcus dove behind the counter as bullets splintered wood and shattered coffee cups. The air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and fear. "You're still thinking like a Marine, Reed," Donovan's voice carried over the chaos. "But this isn't war, this is business." Martinez moved like a shadow through the darkness, taking position near the kitchen. Tom Harris had already activated the sprinkler system, creating a fine mist that diffused the steel vulture's tactical lights. "Business," Marcus called back, his voice steady. "Is that what you told yourself in Fallujah? When you betrayed everything the Corps stands for?" A burst of automatic fire answered him, but Marcus had already moved. Years of training took over as he rolled to new cover, catching one of Donovan's men with a precise shot to the shoulder. The man went down, his weapon clattering across the tile floor. Outside, the battle for the town raged. David Wong's network of cameras showed the steel vultures falling into disarray as they faced resistance at every turn. Linda Chen's pharmacy staff were treating the injured, while Father Michael's congregation had turned the church basement into a safe haven. "Your men are deserting, Jake," Marcus announced, hearing the distant roar of motorcycles fleeing into the night. "They're figuring out that fear only works one way." Donovan's response was a savage laugh. "You think this ends with me? There'll always be others, Reed. Always be someone willing to take what they want." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged, meeting Martinez's eyes across the room. "But there'll always be people willing to stand against them, too." They moved in perfect synchronization, Marine training transcending the years. Martinez provided covering fire while Marcus vaulted the counter, closing the distance to Donovan. The Steel Vulture's leader turned, surprise flashing across his face as he realized his mistake. The two men crashed together in a brutal hand-to-hand struggle. Donovan fought with the desperate fury of a man seeing his empire crumble, but Marcus moved with the certainty of someone fighting for more than just victory. "You forgot the most important thing they taught us," Marcus grunted, blocking a savage strike. "The core isn't about fighting, it's about protecting." A final exchange of blows left Donovan sprawled across a broken table, his weapon skittering away across the floor. Through the shattered windows, red and blue lights began to flash as state police finally arrived. "It's over, Jake," Marcus said, standing over his fallen opponent. "The town's still standing. People are still fighting. You failed." Donovan spat blood, his eyes burning with hatred. "You think you've won? You think anything changes? You can't protect them forever, Reed." Marcus looked around the devastated cafe, seeing not destruction but proof of resilience. Tom Harris was already sweeping up broken glass. Sarah was checking on injured defenders. Through the windows, he could see townspeople emerging from their hiding places, coming together in the street. "I don't have to," Marcus replied quietly. "They've learned to protect themselves." The sunrise broke over the horizon as the state police led Donovan away in handcuffs. The Steel Vultures were scattered, their reputation shattered by a small town's refusal to submit to fear. All around, people were helping each other, tending wounds, sharing stories of resistance and courage. Martinez approached, his uniform dusty, but his eyes bright with pride. "Think they'll be back, sir?" Marcus watched as Father Michael led a prayer circle in the street, as Linda Chin distributed medical supplies, as Mike Townsend and his truckers secured the perimeter. He saw a community that had found its strength, its voice, its power. "Not here," he said finally. "They won't be back here." The morning light streamed through the broken windows of the Crossroads Café, highlighting not just the damage of battle, but the promise of renewal. Sometimes, Marcus realized, the greatest victories weren't won with weapons or tactics, but with the simple courage to stand together against darkness. The war for the town's soul was over. And in the end, it wasn't just Marcus who had won. It was every person who had chosen to fight rather than submit, to stand rather than flee. The Steel Vultures had wanted to rule through fear. Instead, they had taught a town how to be fearless. The rebuilding began before the sun had fully risen. Citizens emerged from their homes with brooms, hammers, and determined spirits, working together to erase the physical scars of the night's battle. The Crossroads Café, despite its broken windows and bullet-pocked walls, became the natural gathering point for the recovery effort. Tom Harris had the coffee brewing by 6 a.m., serving it from a folding table set up on the sidewalk. "Figured we could all use a cup," he said, handing a steaming mug to Marcus. Besides, some traditions shouldn't wait for repairs. The news vans arrived by mid-morning, drawn by reports of the town that had fought back against the Steel Vultures. They found not chaos or destruction, but a community united in purpose. Linda Chin coordinated with insurance adjusters while treating minor injuries. Father Michael led teams of volunteers clearing debris from the streets. Even the children helped, carrying water to workers and collecting scattered belongings. "Quite a story you've given them," Sheriff Cooper said, watching the reporters interview townspeople. "Small town stands up to organized crime. David versus Goliath." Marcus shook his head. Not my story. Belongs to everyone here. The extent of their victory became clearer as reports filtered in throughout the day. The Steel Vultures network was unraveling across 3 states. Other communities, inspired by what they'd seen, were starting to resist. The fear that had given the gang its power was evaporating in the light of day. State police investigators combed through the evidence gathered by David Wong's surveillance network. Donovan's carefully constructed criminal empire was providing a wealth of evidence, not just against the Steel Vultures, but against corrupt officials and businesses that had enabled them. "They're calling you a hero," Martinez said, joining Marcus as he surveyed the cleanup effort from the cafe's repaired front step. "Heroes are for stories," Marcus replied. "This was about ordinary people doing what needed to be done." But the town had other ideas. As the day progressed, more stories emerged of shopkeepers who had become warriors, of waitresses who had run intelligence networks, of truckers who had turned their rigs into barricades. Each tale added to the larger narrative of a community that had found its courage. Sarah appeared with fresh coffee and news from her network of contacts. "The Steel Vultures compound is empty," she reported. "Those who weren't arrested have scattered. Word on the street is their reputation's shot. Nobody's afraid of them anymore." Marcus watched as Tom supervised the installation of new windows, the cafe slowly returning to its familiar shape. "Fear's a funny thing," he observed. "Once you stand up to it, you realize it never had as much power as you thought." In the weeks that followed, the town's transformation became evident in countless small ways. The hardware store didn't just repair its windows, it installed a community bulletin board where people could coordinate neighborhood watch schedules. Linda Chen's pharmacy became an unofficial gathering spot for sharing information and resources. The church basement, once a temporary refuge, was converted into a youth center. Marcus found himself drawn into the changes, though not in the way he'd expected. People didn't treat him as a warrior anymore, but as a teacher. Business owners sought his advice on security measures. Parents asked him to talk to their children about standing up to bullies. Even a local high school invited him to speak about community and courage. "You've started something bigger than you realize," Father Michael told him one quiet afternoon. They sat in the cafe, now restored to its former glory with a few notable additions, including a wall of photographs documenting the night the town fought back. "Other communities are reaching out," the priest continued. "They want to know how we did it. Not just the fighting, but the coming together." Tom Harris joined them, fresh pot of coffee in hand. "Got a call from Pete's Diner over in Miller's Creek. They're organizing their own community council. Said we gave them hope." The ripple effects spread beyond their small town. State legislators began examining laws about community policing and organized crime. Local businesses formed networks of mutual support. The story of their resistance became a blueprint for other communities facing similar threats. Martinez, who had planned to return to his security job in Denver, decided to stay. He and David Wong started a consulting firm, helping other towns develop emergency response networks. Their first client was Miller's Creek. "It's not just about security systems," Martinez explained to Marcus. "It's about showing people they have the power to protect themselves, their neighbors, their way of life." The Steel Vultures' defeat had unexpected consequences. Former members, seeing the collapse of the gang's power, began coming forward with information. The state police uncovered a network of corruption that stretched from local officials to state bureaucrats. Each revelation strengthened the community's resolve to maintain their newfound vigilance. Sarah's intelligence network evolved into a community alert system, connecting businesses and residents in a web of mutual support. The truckers who had turned their rigs into barricades formed an informal auxiliary police force, their CB radios becoming a vital communication link between towns. Even the cafe changed, though in subtle ways. The regular customers still came for coffee and conversation, but there was a new awareness in their interactions, a deeper appreciation for what they'd almost lost and what they'd gained in defending it. "You know what I've noticed?" Tom said one morning, as he and Marcus watched the sun rise through the new windows. "People look each other in the eye more. Stop to chat. Check on their neighbors. Like they've remembered something important." Marcus nodded, understanding. In fighting for their community, They'd rediscovered what community really meant. 1 year after the Steel Vultures' defeat, the town gathered at the Crossroads Café to commemorate what they now called Standing Night. The cafe had become something of a local landmark, with Tom Harris finally giving in to popular demand and mounting a small plaque that read simply, "Here a community found its courage." Marcus sat at his usual spot, watching the celebration unfold. Children played freely in the streets again, their parents no longer scanning the horizon for approaching motorcycles. The hardware store's windows gleamed in the setting sun, its community bulletin board covered with notices for local events rather than warnings about gang activity. "Hard to believe it's been a year," Sarah said, sliding a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. She'd opened her own diner on the other side of town, but still picked up shifts at the cafe for old time's sake. "Feels longer," Marcus replied, "and shorter." The town had changed in ways both visible and invisible. The security cameras David Wong had installed remained, but they were now monitored by a community watch program. Martinez's consulting firm had expanded, helping towns across 3 states develop their own protection networks. Even Father Michael's sermons had evolved, speaking less about turning the other cheek and more about the responsibility of standing together against injustice. Linda Chen approached their table, her pharmacy coat exchanged for evening wear. "Just got word from the state prosecutor's office," she said quietly. "Donovan's trial is over. Guilty on all counts. With the evidence we gathered, he's looking at 30 years minimum." The news rippled through the cafe, but the celebration didn't stop. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembrance and renewal. "You ever regret it?" Tom asked Marcus later, as the gathering wound down. "Getting involved? Standing up?" Marcus looked around the cafe, taking in the faces he'd come to know so well. The trucker who turned his rig into a barricade was teaching his daughter to play chess. The retired teacher who'd coordinated safe houses was sharing stories with wide-eyed teenagers. Each person carried their own memory of that night, their own piece of the larger story. "You know what I regret?" Marcus said finally. "Thinking I could find peace by avoiding conflict. Real peace comes from facing what's wrong and standing up for what's right." As night fell, the cafe's lights cast a warm glow onto the street. Someone had hung a Marine Corps flag beside the town banner, the 2 symbols of service and community intertwined. Marcus stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The rumble of motorcycles still echoed along the interstate sometimes, but it no longer carried fear. The Steel Vultures had wanted to rule through intimidation, never understanding that true strength comes not from causing fear, but from overcoming it. Inside the cafe, Tom was closing up, going through the same routine he'd followed for 20 years. But now there was a baseball bat behind the counter that would never be used, a silent alarm that would never be triggered, and a community that would never again mistake silence for peace. Marcus touched the Marine Corps emblem on his jacket, thinking of all the battles he'd fought, all the places he'd served. He'd come to this town looking for quiet, for an escape from conflict. Instead, he'd found something far more valuable, a cause worth fighting for, a community worth protecting, and a different kind of peace, earned not through retreat, but through standing firm. The Crossroads Cafe's lights went out, but the town remained illuminated by starlight and memory. In the end, it hadn't been Marcus who saved the town. It had been the town that saved itself, rediscovering its own strength, its own courage, its own heart. And in that discovery, they'd all found something worth defending, something that no force of darkness could ever take away, the simple, unshakable power of people standing together, refusing to bow to fear, choosing to fight for what they believed in. The story of their resistance would be told and retold, not as a tale of war, but as a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are won not with weapons, but with unity, courage, and the unwavering belief that community is worth fighting for. For Marcus Reed, former Marine and reluctant hero, it was enough. More than enough. It was home.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.